Welcome to Constructive Thinking, a podcast by the Progressive Contractors Association of Canada. My name is Paul Jong, CEO of PCA. Today, we'll be talking with Stewart Muir, President and CEO of ResourceWorks. We will draw on Stewart's long track record of advocacy in support of thoughtful and intentional development of Canada's natural resource sector. Welcome, Stewart.
Thank you, Paul.
So I think what would be best is perhaps for you to introduce yourself and the work of ResourceWorks. Like, how long have you been managing that organization? What's kind of the core, vision and purpose of the organization?
Yeah, well, ResourceWorks, we're a not-for-profit based in Vancouver, and we came about a dozen years ago. If you think back to those years, 2012, 13, 14, that was when there was this slate of projects in Vancouver on the West Coast, mostly, but getting to the West Coast or serving the West Coast in different ways, I would say, rough guess, $100 billion worth of projects were on the slate going into permitting. And these were projects that weren't hypothetical. In fact, 4 of them have been built. Site C Dam, Coastal GasLink Pipeline, Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline, and of course, LNG Canada. These 4 major projects have changed BC, they've changed Canada. But back then, they were things in the future. They didn't even have their permits. And there was a realization, I would say, across the business, the labor communities, that this was going to be very tough to deliver because BC has a certain reputation for being kind of the California of Canada. And that means a little bit that green wall reputation you have on the West Coast of the U.S. and Canada, of being tough to get to tidewater. In fact, when we started talking about the project, before we came up with the name ResourceWorks, we called it the Market Access Project because it's all about getting Canadian goods to market, access to market. It was the mantra. That's really the background. But my background, the reason I really felt that this was especially my thing is that I came out of media. I'd been a journalist for decades. I'd kind of gotten to the top of the slippery pole in that field. I was looking for other things to do. I was doing some consulting work and began thinking about also my environmental work. I've been trained in environmental history in graduate school. I worked on charitable nature causes in, at that time, recent years that were very close to me. I've always been one like everyone in Metro Vancouver, everyone in BC, who cherishes the natural surroundings we have because it's so special and beautiful. And yet we also know we need to, make a living and pay for the things we need that we can't make ourselves or grow ourselves. So that's kind of the background to it, Paul.
Well, that's fascinating. And one of the questions I was going to ask you, and you kind of touched on it a little bit, is what were the conditions that were present, as you say, 12 years ago when you started this thing up? And are the issues and the kind of the context materially different now than it was then? Or is it still kind of the same old in terms of the challenges, or have things actually kind of progressed and evolved since then?
Isn't that a great question? Because, sometimes I think it's the same, that, nothing's changed, which to me is a negative thought. Others might think it's a positive thing if things don't change. But at other times, I think, wow, this is a whole different equation of what we're dealing with. And I would say in balance that, yeah, things are really different. There's a lot of big differences. I think at that time, there were, policies coming in on climate that were relatively new and being, sort of coherently organized, and the public was starting to really wrap their heads around them and genuinely concerned. At this juncture, a dozen years later, I think there's a whole new wave of saying, well, did we get it right with those policies? Should we be reviewing things? In fact, there are some review processes going on, which I think is positive. Other things that are different, the world is proving to be what it's always been, a place where countries look after their own interests. And I think it's been a decade where Canada didn't look after its own interests. We thought we were a post-national state and we didn't have interests. But every other country doesn't forget that kind of stuff. And now I think we're remembering that. I don't know if we've quite gotten to the point where we know what to do about that, but thank goodness I feel that there's an appreciation that, say polling, there's indications there that people are seeing this. So positive differences on the whole, but we still haven't got things resolved.
Unfortunately. We're going to come back to some of those themes of change and change that's been thrust on us, and in some ways change that perhaps we needed, a stick in our side that needed to kind of propel us to do some of these things differently. But for our viewers who perhaps are not familiar with ResourceWorks, obviously they can visit the website And in doing so, they would find a robust kind of curation of different articles and pieces, conferences that you've spoke at, podcasts that you've done. If you were to summarize, the website or summarize the body of your work, what are the top 3 or 4 things that are important to you right now?
Yeah. And, our audience, we think, is mainly people who have a disposition favorably tuned to the things we stand for, which is, energy security, affordability, getting things built so that we can create jobs and have employment and be able to pay for the things we need. That's our bias, and we're absolutely upfront about it. And so if you're interested in learning the context for that and you're staying abreast of the trends, we're a good place for that. But we also, I'm very active in LinkedIn. I often post articles, my thoughts, spur of the moment. It's a way to get out there quickly. We have the podcast Power Struggle that I've been doing since last year at powerstruggle.ca. You can see that. I think, Paul, the work we have done with Indigenous Partnerships Success Showcase for 6 years now, at our next conference later this year, the story of economic reconciliation is a solution to the congestion we have. And I just today have been circulating and talking with some Indigenous leaders. I think there's a full-throated cry, a call to action to develop Canada in a way that has Indigenous participation. If there's one thing, if I was asked, if there could be a legacy of this work, one thing of all the different things we do, to me, it would be to be able to look upon the First Nations and Indigenous peoples of Canada being in the place they want to be in terms of the long-term future. I don't think they're there yet.
Well, I'm going to put a peg in that because I wanted to get to that topic because I think it's so incredibly important. But before we get there, I want to kind of run through some of the current landscape. And I expressly do not intend to draw you into a political discussion or political commentary. My own organization is politically neutral. We understand that in construction, we have to work under governments of all stripes. But we're very strong, as I think you are, on being very clear and intentional in our advocacy. And I know that you've been doing that for years. So one area that has been a puzzle, I think, for people like you and I, going back to the Trudeau years, was this so-called just transition. You guys have written on this topic. My question for you is, where is that project now that Trudeau has left the stage? I mean, we now have a new prime minister in place who's written a book called Values. He is definitely a person who, at least by his prior articulation, has a very distinct perspective on climate change and those kind of things. But he hasn't, in the election cycle, really, to my ear, articulated a lot of that. Has that gone away with Carney for his own sake, but also in terms of the Trudeau just transition piece, or is that still sitting in the background somewhere?
Yeah, I don't think Carney's made up his mind. I think he's dealing with the real politic of being the prime minister of a G7 country. Soon we'll be hosting not just the G7 as we speak today, but also there's some other countries coming that I think Saudi Arabia, India, they show up, and you're talking about, the hard realities of the planet we're on here and the power plays in that. So I think that what I see the most from Carney is he's doing the things he said he would do. There's quite a bit of skepticism, and reservation. When we see the action, we'll believe that you were telling the truth, or at least that you were capable of doing the things that you said you would be wanting to do. And I think there's still some hesitation, when we have 38 CEOs from Calgary writing a letter with one voice, one message saying, the emissions cap, which even the Parliamentary Budget Office says is a production cap, we don't need that. Don't do that, Prime Minister. Same with C-69 and the Impact Assessment Act. Well, in both those things, he's intransigent based on what he said. So he's willing to develop Canada's potential as an energy superpower, but he won't remove the two greatest impediments to doing that. It strikes me as if you were trying to convince your dietitian or doctor or spouse that you were serious about the thing you were promising them that was very important in your relationship, that you would probably remove the two biggest barriers to you succeeding. And he's not doing that. So I think if he doesn't act on it quickly, he's going to have trouble being taken seriously. I'm sorry, but I would like to see him succeed because I'd like Canada to succeed. But I've got to be honest in saying that it's not a political statement either, because we're not partisan. We're just like you are, Paul. Yeah.
Well, it appears that you have looked over my shoulder when I created my kind of talking points. So let me just pivot off of a couple of the things that you mentioned there. Carney has in his election platform and since talked about Canada being an energy superpower. He traveled with his energy minister to Calgary and met with many of those CEOs that you referred to. And the question that I have, which you kind of already answered, is it real? Is it to be believed that he is going to have an agnostic position when it comes to quote the word energy? Or they're kind of like little italicized words underneath there, which are renewables only, atomic, nuclear, renewable jet fuel. And I'll say this: our members, construction companies who work across Canada, are happy to build all the above.
Yep.
But what we do get frustrated with, going back to the previous administration and yet to be seen with the current administration, is this kind of shadow play, and some of it comes in the form of, I'm trying not to lead you here, but saying to the industry, hey, oil and gas is great as long as it's carbon sequestration, and then that what comes with that are grants and subsidies. So maybe talk a little bit about that, kind of break it down in terms of what you think he means by energy superpower.
Yeah, that's a good question. And let me quickly touch on the question you asked, but I didn't address just transition. Where does it stand? One thing I think the world is realizing is that transition is not a thing. Not a thing in the sense that people think it is. I just had on my podcast, Power Struggle, a French energy historian by the name of Jean-Baptiste Fressoz. He's written a book called More and More and More. And that's basically the story of humanity's relationship with energy. We don't transition off things. We add new things. So, we didn't transition off wood. We're using more wood than ever. We didn't transition off coal. We're using more coal than ever. And there's this mythology that there's this arc of history that is getting off fossil fuels onto renewables. Well, that's a talking point for groups that are advocating for that, but it's not actually a thing that's happening, which is not to say there isn't a proliferation of renewables. And I'd be the first to say that's a great thing, but it's contributing to the more and more and more. And so the just part of it is that's politics, and there's a lot of nuance in that. I think we need a whole podcast for that. But what does it mean to be an energy superpower? I think it means getting to the world the thing that the world wants from Canada. What does the world want from Canada? It wants really basic things that consist of oil and natural gas and uranium and coal from British Columbia, especially. You take those four things and you say, what's the value of those things in the Canadian economy? That's a huge chunk of the Canadian economy right there, even before you get into some other energy projects we have. It's great we can send electricity across the border to the United States. We can't send electricity to Belgium.
Yes.
But Belgium would like our natural gas. Belgium would like uranium. They're having decided they were going to go fossil free. They've reconsidered and they just decided to double their nuclear fleet again. They're going up. And even Denmark, which is covered in wind farms because they were going to go 100% renewables and fossil free. Oh, they're building nuclear now, and they're probably importing quite a bit of LNG. So you see this sort of awakening. Canada's arrival as an energy superpower won't be quite the way that Stephen Harper talked about when he started using that term for Canada, where it was like Energy East and KXL and Northern Gateway, like all these big oil pipes. That doesn't seem to be something that will happen in our scope of time, our horizon. It might happen in the future, but what will happen, though, I think, is that one more oil pipe, a couple more natural gas pipes, maybe the East Coast for LNG. I mean, heck, France is investing in West Coast LNG, the Total people. If I was in Quebec and paying attention to world affairs, I'd be thinking, maybe I can help my francophonie frères with their energy needs by getting more of what they're asking for, which is LNG. So those are the things we need. That's the puzzle. That's the puzzle to solve. It won't be easy. And I guess the last thing is, and I think you sort of touch on it, is you need a vision, because once you take the lid off the jigsaw puzzle that you brought home from the store, you're no longer looking at a pretty picture of a mountain scenery. You're looking at a whole bunch of jagged pieces that you have to put together. And we tend to obsess with the inside the box picture, which is truly scary, rather than the picture. I think let's look at the picture before we get into it, because that's what it's about. What is the energy superpower? It's prosperous, it's long-term, it's sustainable and acceptable to the citizenry. Is it perfect in every way that every advocate says it has to be? Well, life doesn't work that way.
Yeah. So one element, if we were having this conversation about Canada's, sort of acceptance of it being a potential energy superpower and what does it actually look like. But down in the weeds of that conversation is another conversation which I want to get your perspective on. And I think that the term, getting this wrong, is carbon leakage. The concept is that we are perhaps overdoing our zeal in trying to greenify our economy in a way that we can sort of say, hey, we're carbon free or moving towards carbon free, but all we're doing is displacing energy production to jurisdictions that don't give a rip or care less than we do. And to what degree, Stewart, do you think Canada or Canadians are becoming aware that we actually know what we're doing when we build oil sands facilities in a sustainable, environmentally conscious and community aware way, and that we should hold our shoulders high, or are Canadians still not getting that message?
Canadians are open to the idea. They are not fully bought in. I think those who are bought in are more numerous than they have been in the past. And that's why I think we're at a moment here, and the window is open. It won't stay open forever.
Yeah.
And so education, getting the message out, trusted, understandable messages from, people who are trusted, very important to have now because, this is a huge problem.
Yeah. You alluded earlier to the Impact Assessment Act and for some rather chilling consequence or reality that Carney did not seem to indicate that he was willing to renovate it or retool it, notwithstanding the Supreme Court requirements. The question I have for you is, he has nonetheless, even though he said he's not going to revisit the Bill C-69 Impact Assessment Act, has said that we're going to have a new system of one project, one review, and we're going to reduce 5 years of regulatory passage to 2. My quick aside is, do you know where he got the 5 years from? Because I thought it was a lot longer than 5. I never knew that it was 5 until I was told that. But my general question is, what are we to make with those statements? Because at the face of it, one has to be encouraged that he is indicating a seemingly strong intent to streamline and tighten up the regulatory passage in general, but also in particular in the eyes of investors who've looked at Canada in askance for so many years.
Yeah, I think he probably had a visit from the consultants who worked on Trudeau at the beginning, talking about deliverology and that kind of stuff, which never really played out for the Trudeau group, but he's got the same thing going on. And I think in this case, it's quick wins. He'd get some quick wins, which means deal with some projects that could be delivered without legislative change, maybe some regulatory work, but nothing that needs to go through the Parliament, and do worthwhile projects that are nation-building projects that proliferate of that description. I don't know. I haven't really had a look in detail. I think it's a good idea to do that if he can, but it won't solve the big, the tier 1 projects. Or, that's the oil sands, that's natural gas, primarily. Those two things are the tier 1, and they also depend on having, tier 1 infrastructure to get them to market. So if you can't address both of those, then none of this really will make a difference in the quality of life of Canadians.
Yeah. This may seem like a bit of a random question, but one of the things that I've had chats with people, at coffee shops and bar over a beer, is the concept, and this goes back to Canada's, developing itself as an energy superpower, getting rid of some of these interprovincial boundaries, our lack of access to tidewater. What do you think of the concept of this utility corridor concept? Maybe it's corridors plural, Atlantic to Pacific, up to the Hudson's Bay. Is that a pipe dream, or is that something that you think can come to fruition?
Yeah, well, if the concept is that will be de-risked, that will be a geographic zone that governments have passed legislation and they've worked out local stakeholder issues, and then it's kind of come all. We built an industrial park. Come and build your factory. Come and build your. Except it's not a patch of land near the airport. It's a strip across the whole country. Yeah, I think it resonates. People can make sense of that. Is it likely to occur? I hope it is. I think there's a prioritization. I think if we, it has to be aligned to the things that are the greatest opportunities. So to me, putting that effort into reaching, Hudson's Bay or the Arctic isn't where I would, put my eggs. And I would be looking at the West Coast, because the future is about Asia. The part of the world that is using more of the products that Canada produces is Asia, not Europe. And it's, Africa too, I think, is coming into that zone, and some other parts of the world, but mainly it's across the Pacific. So it's got to be energy corridors for the Pacific. And that means, of course, the First Nations relationships along those corridors. That's got to be number one. Ian Anderson, who was such a great leader of Trans Mountain when he was CEO building that, he has told the story a few times in my hearing of what he did at the beginning. He actually drove that whole corridor, along the roads before anything was built or even proposed, and he met with every one of the First Nations along the way to show respect, to gain understanding. And I think that's really the thing that we've learned from this past decade of how one shows respect and trust. It's not just that First Nations have rights in the Constitution. Of course, they have rights, but if we don't show the respect and regard for the people, then I think we're not clicking. Yeah. And we have some good examples of success. So yeah, turn that into a corridor concept. Absolutely, go for it, and let's see what we can do with that. So yeah, I would back, but I'd like to do some research. I'd like to see some research done in 2025 before the year is out on what it means. So really get into the details.
Yeah. I noted earlier, and you've referred again now to the importance of Indigenous engagement, and Ian Anderson's story, his true story of meeting with these Indigenous groups proactively, not retroactively, was a game changer for the Trans Mountain project. Let's come back to that in a moment, but I want to talk about one thing, which is a bit of an oddity, which is, as we mentioned earlier, the whole Trump tariff thing has kind of propelled Canada to take a deeper look at itself and say, like, why do we have these interprovincial trade barriers, and why are we sitting on our hands when we should be doing some of these things ourselves? So we're this kind of dance between quote unquote nationalism, not political nationalism, but like a vision for an industrial nation, and provincialism. And you have this oddity where Premier Eby basically says he doesn't want to have any more LNG. And I think it's on the face of it discordant with that theme of provinces working to get along. It's also discordant with the fact that pipelines are regulated federally. And I wonder if you can unpack what you think Eby is thinking, other than that sort of broader context of BC being a bit of a different animal, and we all kind of come to know that. Does this go back to Christy Clark's 5 conditions, or is it a different mindset that Eby has? Like, what's going on with his intransigence there?
Yeah, to this day, I believe that Christy Clark's 5 conditions were the reason that we were able to see projects go ahead. Even though I know there's some legend attached to that, which is different, but it really was to make it possible. Had she not done that, she would not have been able to deal with the expectations of BC residents, regardless of what powers provinces have within the Federation. And the proof in the pudding is this: that project, Trans Mountain, was completed, and it met the 5 conditions, and there was social order. Mm-hmm. With David Eby. I'm not seeing that a strategy that matches that description in any way, shape, or form. I don't think, if the opportunities that a province has to contribute to the well-being of Confederation consists largely in getting goods to market that the world is willing to pay for, then opposing LNG means that you're not serious about recognizing that, because LNG is what the world wants. Right now, Japan is importing, I think about 8% of its LNG comes from Russia. So do they want to buy from Putin? I don't think so. Japanese have been all over BC for many, many years, working to develop LNG opportunities here, natural gas. They've invested a lot of capital, a lot of time, a lot of patience, a lot of respect for Canadians. They don't have a lot to show for it on the LNG front. They will soon with LNG Canada. They've got lots of propane coming their way from Canada, but they're still frustrated. And I think if the message is, no, we're not going to sell you what you most desperately want, and we'll get from the Middle East or from Russia if you don't get it from us, whom are you serving? I'm confused. When it comes to the oil pipeline, to send your deputy premier to the premier's meeting to say, I'm not opposed to the oil pipeline, but then also say oneself from abroad, I'm against that, and say the same thing in another. I think that's a mixed message. Maybe there's a strategy to mixed messages that one might employ at some time, I suppose. I don't know what that would be in this case. I think that Premier Smith has not made any secret of what she would like to see. If I was advising, I would say, when senior political figures advocate for specific projects that is a complex path you're marking on, committing to one particular thing. You might say picking a winner. I'm sure that Premier Smith has a strategy in this regard, but one thing that's come out of it is this sense that there's a yes and a no here, and that's a negotiated position maybe you can begin with and then come to a maybe, I don't know. But in something with this amount of recent history and this amount of national consequence, it would be great to see if we had someone like we saw with Premier Christy Clark, where it was, well, if she could satisfy these conditions, because to me, I'll go back to that analogy. I've been using this a little bit of the jigsaw. You go to the store, the beautiful picture of that mountain scenery and that jigsaw puzzle, 1,000 pieces. I'm going to take that home. And then you open up the lid. Oh my God, how am I ever going to do this? So, we're still going to be stuck in the, oh my God, this phase. Let's put the lid back on for a moment and just look at the picture. What is it? Maybe we should change the color. Maybe we should rearrange where's the lake here or whatever. But let's get the picture that we agree on. And what is that picture? I think any person, look into yourself and say, what is the picture I have? What is the vision? What is the world that I want my grandchildren to live in? My great-grandchildren? What is that Canada? Paint that picture in your mind. You're listening to this. That's the picture on this jigsaw box. That's why we're doing this. We're not doing it because so-and-so will get, richer, or so-and-so will gain something that so-and-so doesn't have. We're doing it for some other reason. Let have that in our mind. Then we open the box again and we say, okay, we got some work to do here. That's how we have to approach it. I'm sorry, I don't think there's another way to do it. And right now, we're not going about it the right way in every respect.
Yeah, well said. Listen, as we begin to wind down, I've mentioned that I wanted to come back to the topic of Indigenous engagement, and you mentioned economic reconciliation. In my own, admittedly relatively lengthy time in the industry, going back about 30 years, I recall a time when contractors would, perhaps not grudgingly, but there was kind of a requirement on a pipeline project or a project in the oil sands to hire a certain number of Indigenous people. And you fast forward to today, and the landscape has so dramatically changed, Stewart, where no longer is it just a sort of a nod of the hat to employment hiring, although that's still an important consideration, training, employment, apprenticeships. But more so now, we see examples of Indigenous business groups and organizations having equity ownership stake in construction companies of their own completely 100% construction companies, equity positions in major projects in the LNG sector, Silisms, Heisla. Talk a bit more as we wind this up about how important it is for industry stakeholders and I guess Canadians in general to understand the evolving and crucial nature of Indigenous engagement in building Canada.
Yeah, the first thing to understand, I think, is that there has been a intergenerational breakage amongst the First Nations of Canada. Residential schools are one part of it. I don't think that's the only part, but a very large driver of that. There's a generation emerging of now, you might say, like middle-aged professionals from First Nations. It came home to me years ago. You might have been in the same room in Prince George at the BC Natural Resource Forum. It might have been 2018, but Perry Bellegarde, he was the Grand Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. He says something there that only someone such as himself could say, and it's just resonated with me almost every day since, which is when he said this: "There's nothing wrong with a rich Indian." Now, those are Perry Bellegarde's words, not my words.
Yes.
And you think about that, and I realize you don't have a picture, you don't have a mental map in your mind, if you're Canadian, of what that rich person he's describing, he's looked like, because there isn't that probably in your neighborhood. Now, that's changing, and it will change. There will be First Nations who have personal wealth, and there will be lots of First Nations who live in, a traditional way, whatever that might be defined as. And I think a restoration of the culture of First Nations is the precondition to what you've talked about with the not just benefit agreements. That was, a dozen years ago, that's what we were talking about. You do this deal, you support or don't oppose this project going through your traditional territories or your band council lands, and then you'll get this payment. You get a check in the mail.
Yeah.
And then it went from there to things like, joint ventures. We could go into business together. You'll help me with that. And then we moved now into another territory, which I think is the most intriguing one of all, which is the equity ownership of whole projects, maybe 50.1 or more percent control. Conceding control. That's a huge step for investors, for executives to get their heads around, but they actually are doing that. That's what's changed. And I think it's been enabled by the healing of enough First Nations who are saying, we need to bring the ancestors along, the parent generation, the grandparents. There's some broken people there. But we can only bring them along if we have wealth, if we have the ability to provide the things they need to preserve culture and language. The work that you've done has been very inspiring to me, Paul, in language work, because to me it speaks to preserving the culture of First Nations in the ways that those First Nations are describing and dictating for themselves. No one else can do that. And then, if you lose language, you lose culture. If you lose culture, you're you die as a people. So I think those possessors of MBAs and law degrees now and entrepreneurs who are First Nations individuals, they're the ones who are grabbing this and saying, yeah, we're going to get it done. There's that generation, and behind them, there's a whole new group of the millennials who are that description and more so. So, I see the arc of history is going in a positive direction in this regard, and all the good things that happen in Canada in the future, I think, will be because of success in that domain.
Well, on that positive note, I do find optimism in your remarks. I think there's a lot to be, perhaps concerned, or at the very least monitored when it comes to some of the new political environment. But some of the trend lines here in terms of our environmental credentials, the evolution and the transformation of how Indigenous peoples have been involved in our industry offers much hope for us in general, for Canadians, but also for us as a contractor community. So, Stewart, I want to thank you for your time. You've been generous with it, and very much appreciate the work that you do for Resource Works, and look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks for having me on, Paul. Really appreciate it.
Take care, Stewart.
Thanks.